الأمن؟ نعم.
The Syrian opposition calls for a no-fly zone and safe routes in the Friends of Syria conference.
Nothing at all for standing up on behalf of the Assad regime. The only way...
Massive protests takes place today, and El Suwaida protests against the regime amid holding funerals. More than 70 killed in Syria today, mostly in Damascus, and the regime increases its military campaigns on the capital. Good evening and welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. The third conference for the Friends of Syria, which was hosted by France with the participation of representatives from more than 80 countries, called the Syrian opposition to unite and to form an alternative to al-Assad's regime. Meanwhile, the president of the Syrian National Council called the participants to take a decision to establish a no-fly zone and the humanitarian corridors in Syria. On the other hand, participants stressed on the need to overthrow al-Assad's regime and to take measures under Chapter 7 and to support all efforts to achieve the aspirations of the Syrian people to freedom and democracy, calling for the formation of a transitional government.
Nous comptons bien qu'entre la pression internationale, la pression de la résistance intérieure syrienne et tout ce qui...
The Syrian crisis imposes a major challenge to the international community to end the violence and reach a political solution. The Third Friends of Syria conference took place in Paris in the presence of about 100 states and in the absence of veto holders Russia and China. The Syrian opposition activists and members of the Syrian National Council agreed on a decision to establish safe routes and no-fly zones. The Deputy UN Envoy to Syria, Nasser al-Qadwa, in turn pointed out that the working group in Geneva called for an end to the violence and to activate the six-point plan immediately, and agreed that the process of transition must include a devised transition, including members from the government of the regime and the opposition and other groups based on compatibility.
أنا أتساءل اليوم.
Secretary General of the League of Arab States also stressed in his speech that the Geneva meeting succeeded in achieving a consensus in principle to move to the joint implementation of the Annan Plan, noting the need to agree on specific steps to ensure their implementation. The U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton condemned Russia and China for the support to the military machine in the suppression of the revolution. She also called on Congress to return to the Security Council to issue a decision on the transition process in Syria for the implementation of the Annan Plan. The Turkish position was confirmed by Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoglu, which called for more pressure on the Syrian system that is trying to gain time to commit more crimes, while the German Foreign Minister Guido Westerwelle called to find a solution to the crisis in Syria as soon as possible, on the basis of a peaceful and democratic order to Syria. He added that al-Assad should not have any role in the transition process, which will be accompanied with a process of economic transition, in which Catherine Ashton renewed her demand to deliver aid to affected people.
The French President François Hollande said on the opening of the conference that the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria was inevitable and called for more action from the UN Security Council.
One thing is certain, that's that Bashar al-Assad's regime will not last. Its fall is inevitable, and the arrival of the force of democracy in Syria will be determined by what we can decide together, and the earlier the better. Today, our meeting here in Paris has to make one aim for itself: encourage the Security Council to accept, as quickly as possible, its responsibilities to support the plan providing a way out of the crisis presented by the Special Envoy Kofi Annan. That's the aim that we're targeting.
From her side, the U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton urged world powers to Russia and China that they would pay a price for impeding progress toward a democratic transition in Syria.
We should go back and ask for a resolution in the Security Council that imposes real and immediate consequences for noncompliance, including sanctions under Chapter 7. Now, what can every nation and group represented here do? I ask you to reach out to Russia and China and to not only urge but demand that they get off the sidelines and begin to support the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people. I will tell you very frankly, I don't think Russia and China believe they are paying any price at all, nothing at all, for standing up on behalf of the Assad regime. The only way that will change is if every nation represented here directly and urgently makes it clear that Russia and China will pay a price because they are holding up progress, blockading it, that is no longer tolerable.
And the Turkish Foreign Minister, Ahmed Davutoglu, said that the defections prove that the Syrian government is crumbling, and he stressed the need for continued international pressure to stop the Syrian regime for its ongoing actions. The Secretary General of the Arab League, Nabil Arabi, said in his speech that Geneva meeting succeeded in achieving a consensus in principle to move the joint implementation of Annan's plan. He pointed the need to agree on specific steps to ensure the implementation of Annan's plan.
All the countries that addressed the conference, or most of them, have said we must go to the Security Council and issue Chapter 7 resolution, which leads to the implementation of the Annan plan within a specific time frame. This is what we hope and I think will happen.
While the United Arab Emirates Foreign Minister, Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan, considered at the opening of the conference that the Syrian regime is moving the international community to despair, saying that a diplomatic solution is hopeless and further sanctions will not affect the behavior of the Syrian regime.
I don't know how many more of our brothers in Syria have to die before we look to revise this strategy. I asked today, I asked the Secretary General of the Arab League, I asked my brothers gathered here, where is Mr. Kofi Annan? Where is he? Does he have something better to do than to be here in this conference to show his concern for the Syrian people? I regret that Mr. Kofi Annan is in Geneva today. It's embarrassing for someone like Kofi Annan to be in Geneva and not here in this conference.
And coming up later in the bulletin, the regime continues bombarding the city of Idlib. Welcome back. You're watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. More updates on the local news. The province of Al Suwaida witnessed today a funeral honoring yesterday's murdered citizens of the city and neighboring villages who were killed by Al-Assad's regime forces during one of the demonstrations yesterday. Meanwhile, the protesters chanted for freedom and demanded the downfall of Al-Assad's regime. The regime forces, accompanied by guerrilla forces sent by the regime, showered another funeral in the village of Al-Qraya with gunfire and tear gas in a way to disperse the funeral crowd. Meanwhile, the citizens of Suwaida and the city of Al-Qraya held the funerals of Ma'in Radwan and Safwan Shkir, and demonstrations went out calling for freedom and the overthrow of Al-Assad's regime. At least 70 were murdered today in Syria, mostly in the rural districts of Damascus, and the citizens of the districts of Tadamun, Al-Qadam and Al-Qabun in the Syrian capital went out in today's protests with the theme of Friday for the People's Liberation War. Also, the Damascus outskirts were brutalized with artillery shelling, which targeted the towns of Deir al-Asafir and Zibdin. Meanwhile, the people of Deir Qanun and the city of Al-Zabadani filled the streets in demonstrations, persistently demanding their freedom and the downfall of Al-Assad's regime. On the other hand, the regime forces continued to shell many cities in the countryside of Damascus. The cities of Qatana, Masraba and Douma were heavily shelled by the regime troops today, murdering and wounding many civilians. And once again, the regime forces mercilessly massacred a whole family in Daraya during the relentless shelling on the city.
The regime forces bombarded the suburbs of Damascus yesterday, which included the town of Madaya and Al-Zabadani, which were extensively bombed by mortar shells and rocket missiles, which also targeted Douma. This bombardment also reached the town of Masraba after it was targeted by the military planes of the regime, as well as invading it and committing countless crimes, whereas the town of Madira witnessed arrest campaigns by hundreds of the guerrilla forces, which held captive a big number of citizens, as well as invading homes and robbing their contents amid heavy gunfire in the towns and villages of Eastern Ghouta. The neighborhoods of Al-Qabun and Al-Asali were also invaded by the regime forces, which captured many civilians. Meanwhile, several members of the Syrian Freedom Army announced capturing a general and a soldier from the Presidential Guard. The movement of the rebels was triggered in the capital Damascus, where over 30 roads were cut in many areas by the rebels of the revolution, despite the military besiegement that the regime is imposing onto the towns.
The province of Hama witnessed today a big spread for the security forces, especially in the square of Al-Asi and the neighborhoods of Al-Arba'in, Al-Hamidiyya, Ta'awuniya, and many others, while the snipers of the regime forces, as usual, spread on the roofs of the buildings. Meanwhile, in the neighborhoods of Al-Qusur, the regime's tanks were seen all over the town, while a massive explosion shook the town near the barrier of Al-Mahwara. Staying in Hama, where mass demonstrations swept all the neighborhoods. Also, its countryside witnessed demonstrations despite the bombardment and the besiegement on Al-Latamina. Also, Kafr Zeta and Karnaz protested against the regime, supporting the affected cities and demanding the overthrow of the regime. 24 hours of persistent shelling targeted the districts of Jurat al-Shiyah, Al-Khalidiyya and Old Homs. The random bombing was amid targeting everything in the city, according to activists. And these are images showing the explosions that the neighborhoods of Al-Khalidiyya witnessed, among which the regime forces continuous shelling.
استمرار القصف الصاروخي على الحي المحاصر.
And staying in the neighborhood of Jurat